Will you pray for me? Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Do you know the name Otto Warmbier? January of 2016, Otto Warmbier went with a group of Americans on a tour of North Korea. Spent a few days there, and when he was in the airport in Pyongyang, about to board a plane to come home, two security personnel walked up and put their hands on his shoulders and led him away. Turns out he'd been accused of trying to steal a North Korean propaganda poster, which is apparently a big deal there. They released security camera footage from the hotel where he was staying, in which you can see a grainy figure taking this poster off the wall from a couple of different angles. At no point can you see the person's face in this video, but it was enough for the authorities in North Korea to lead him away that day, to lock him up where he stayed until just this month, when, on the 12th of June, it was announced that after much diplomatic conversation, he would be returned home to the United States. And he came home, Otto, this young 20-something man, on the 13th of June, in a coma. Or not exactly a coma. They say that he could breathe on his own and he could blink his eyes, but he couldn't respond to anything around him. And a few days later, he died. North Korean officials said that he was in this coma because of botulism. And not only botulism, but he had taken a sleeping pill while having botulism. And the combination of those two things put him in this coma. And when medical examiners here were looking at him before he died, examining him head to toe, they found that he had brain damage that is consistent with asphyxiation, which they admitted could happen if he had had botulism poisoning, which paralyzes you. If he had been paralyzed in that way and taken a sleeping pill, that could make him stop breathing, they said, and that could explain the lack of oxygen to his brain that did the damage that put him into the coma that led to his death. That is possible, they said. But it's hard not to wonder. They examined his body. There was no damage to the skull or the neck or the back, no obvious wounds anywhere on the body, just this coma that could only have happened by the strangest confluence of circumstances. Circumstances posited by a foreign government that we all have reason to be suspicious of. It's so easy to just assume that those North Koreans, that oppressive regime, did something terrible to this young man who at worst was guilty of making a foolish mistake. It's hard to trust that government. It's hard not to assume that something terrible happened to Otto Warmbier in prison that led to that coma, that led to his death. It's easy to imagine that a government like the North Korean one might do something terrible to someone in their care. Do you know the name Sandra Bland? Sandra was stopped here in these United States by a police officer in July of 2015 for failing to signal a lane change with her car. She was pulled over, and the dash cam of the officer's patrol car shows an interaction that becomes more and more and more heated until finally the officer demands that Sandra Bland exit her car, to which she says no, but a demand into which she finally gives after he threatens to tase her. You see her get out of the car, and then they move out of the frame, and all you can hear is her screaming as she's slammed to the ground. She was brought into jail, and a few days later, they found her hanged in her cell. An official investigation ruled that it was a suicide. She had died of asphyxiation. Another person dead because the lifeblood and oxygen flow was cut off to their brain, and they said that she did it to herself. Some intake reports at the time of her arrest said that in the past she had contemplated or attempted suicide. So that might make sense. But other intake reports that were released to the public had no such information. And many who knew Sandra said she was not capable of such a thing. They found elevated levels of THC in her blood. This is the chemical that gets into your blood if you smoke pot. But then the question is, where did she get weed in prison? A motion-activated camera outside the door to her cell showed no recording for an hour and a half before she was found, which would make sense. It's motion-activated. It doesn't tape. It doesn't turn on unless somebody walks by in the hallway outside. That in and of itself is a problem. She was supposed to be checked on every hour by prison regulations. But it would make sense if nobody walked by that there was no recording for that time, and that's what they claimed. But it's hard not to wonder about that recording, because when they released footage from the dash cam on the arresting officer's patrol car, it was clear, or it sure looked like it had been edited. Cars would be driving down the road and suddenly disappear. People would appear on the sidewalk and disappear from the footage. They claimed it was a faulty camera. It was hard to know. But then they re-released new footage that corrected many of those errors. And so it's hard not to wonder about this footage. The footage of the arrest, it's hard not to wonder about the footage of the hallway outside her cell. Nobody knows what happened, and we probably never will. But it's hard not to wonder. This is the world we live in. This has always been the world we live in, where violence comes out of the blue and descends on unsuspecting people, or descends on people that have made the smallest of errors. And whether it's an oppressive regime abroad or at home, who does it? Or whether it's botulism, whether it's illness or accident, this is the world we live in. It is a world full of violence and death. This is the world that Jesus was talking about. In today's reading, they call this the missionary discourse. He's just about to send his disciples, his followers, his learners out into the world to tell the people the things that he's been telling them, and he's giving them advice about what it's going to be like. And he says this line that so many of us hate to hear in the mouth of Jesus Christ. He says, "I have come not to bring peace, but a sword." This is our Prince of Peace. This is the one at whose birth the heavens opened up, and choirs of angels sang, "Peace on earth, goodwill to all whom God favors." And here he is saying, "I've come not to bring peace, but a sword." And it's hard not to wonder, did we misread our Jesus? Is he that kind of leader after all, just like all the others who pretend to want a peaceful world, but as soon as you cross them, come down, hammer and tongs on you until you are beaten into the ground? Is that what he's like after all? Or is that what the world is like? He says, "I've come not to bring peace, but a sword." But the fact is, Jesus doesn't bring the sword. The sword is already here. We forged it. And if you come into the world saying the kind of things that Jesus says, God notes the fall of every sparrow, and God is there watching when Otto Warmbier and Sandra Bland and anyone at all, God is there when they die. God is there and knows the truth that even the cameras cannot tell. If you go forth saying things like that, saying things like, all of God's children are beloved, things that are so easy to let trip off our tongues, if you say them and mean them and live as if it's true, then that sword will get swung at you sooner or later. Because these systems of violence, you know this, I don't have to tell you, there are people profiting from them. People get rich from prisons. People get rich from running oppressive regimes at home or abroad. People profit from the deaths of millions. And if you try to mess that up, if you go into that situation doing what Jesus said to do, what he was sending his disciples and you into the world to do, then the fact is the sword that is already there will come for you sooner or later. The more change you try to make, the louder you get, the more you agitate, the more truth you tell, the more unedited video footage you share, the more the powers that be become angry. And the angrier they get, the more violent they get. And that's what he was talking about. That's the world he was talking about, and it is grim. It's almost worse than if he had come with a great magic sword of his own to vanquish all his foes. Wouldn't it be better if that's who he was, if he was just a superhero who could knock them all to the ground for us? But what he says is that those who live by the sword die by the sword. And it is a grim picture he paints. But remember this, he too died of asphyxiation once upon a time. He too died by being hanged once upon a time. He too had the violence and the power of the world come crashing down on him. And when he hung there on the cross until his shoulders gave out and his insides collapsed and the breath left his body, that wasn't his end. That breath that left his body, that oxygen that stopped flowing, 3 days later it began to flow again, and he took a great deep breath of new life. He knows what it is to be in a coma with a brain that doesn't work. He knows what it is to hang inside a prison cell. He knows what it is to die without life in your brain. And still he said, "Do not fear." Because that death was not the end. That violence was not his end. He was sending them out to what might be their end, but he wanted them to know that it would not be the final word. It's a violent world, he said, and it will get more violent the more you try to change it. But the more you try to change it, the more I will be with you with power and grace and with lifeblood and oxygen. The more you work, the more you agitate, the more truth you tell, the more unedited video footage you post, the closer you will get to salvation. At least, that's what I'm counting on. Amen.